20 years, 17 doctors. Not a single one had found the answer. Sarah Mitchell ran a $4 billion financial empire from a wheelchair, and the world had grown so used to that fact that nobody questioned it anymore. Nobody asked why. Nobody looked twice. Nobody, that is, except the man who had no business being there at all. He wasn't a doctor, not anymore. He was a single father in a blue uniform, pushing a hand truck through the door of her penthouse office, delivering a box that didn't matter. He looked at Sarah for 8 seconds. Then he said the one thing that 20 years and 17 specialists had never said, and from that moment, nothing stayed the same. Keep watching, because what happens next changes everything neither of them knew they were still waiting for. The rain had been falling since before sunrise, and Michael Turner did not own an umbrella. He kept meaning to buy one. He kept not buying one. That detail belonged to a longer list of small things he'd stopped maintaining after Rachel died, the kind of list a person lets slip when survival replaces living and there's no margin left for anything extra. He pulled his delivery van into the loading bay of the Halstead Capitol Tower at 7:45 that morning, cut the engine, and sat there 3 seconds longer than necessary. Just 3 seconds. Then he climbed out. The cargo was simple. 2 sealed boxes of medical documentation equipment, a portable diagnostic display unit and its calibration accessories, ordered through a third-party vendor and routed to the executive floor. Michael loaded everything onto his hand truck, checked the manifest, and wheeled it through the service entrance. The building was cold, the way expensive buildings always are, aggressively climate-controlled, as though the temperature itself were making a statement about importance. He rode the freight elevator to the 38th floor. His boots were clean, but not new. His uniform was pressed, the way a man presses a uniform when he's up ironing at 5:30 in the morning before waking a 7-year-old girl who won't eat breakfast unless her father is sitting across from her. The small disciplines, the ones nobody notices, the ones that hold a life together the way mortar holds stone. The assistant who met him at the elevator was a woman in her early 40s, composed and exact in the way people get when they've spent years managing someone important. Her name was Karen. She led him down a corridor of pale marble and glass toward the main office without making conversation, and Michael followed without needing any. He'd been in rooms like this before. He remembered the particular weight of silence in rooms where big decisions got made. A silence that pressed lightly on the chest. He knew it the way a man recognizes the smell of a hospital, even far from any hospital, a memory that lives in the body rather than the mind. Sarah Mitchell didn't look up when he walked in. She sat behind a wide, dark desk buried under layered documents, her pen moving across a margin note with the focused speed of someone for whom being interrupted simply wasn't an option. The wheelchair was matte black, custom-framed, positioned with the precision of an office furniture rather than a medical device. She wore a white blazer, collar open, hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed halfway down her nose, giving her the look of someone who'd already decided what everything meant before you opened your mouth. Michael set the boxes down. He pulled out his scanner and waited for the confirmation prompt. While the device processed, his eyes moved, not deliberately, not with any professional intent, but the way eyes move when a person has spent 6 years training himself to observe, a reflex that doesn't switch off just because the license behind it is sitting in a drawer. He saw the angle of her right hip against the seat cushion. He saw where her feet rested, left flat, right pulled slightly back. He saw her left wrist adjust when the air conditioning shifted the top page of her stack by 2 millimeters. He saw the small involuntary flex of her right calf, barely visible, almost nothing, the kind of movement that shows up in exactly 0 cases of structural paralysis and in nearly every case of something else entirely. 8 seconds. Then, low, almost to himself, the words came out before he chose them. Your right foot is pulling back. Sarah looked up for the first time. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the silence of someone who's just heard something so precisely unexpected that the usual social reflexes for responding simply don't fire. Her pen stopped. She looked at him, not at his uniform, not at his scanner, not at the boxes, at him. Michael held her gaze for a second, then looked back down at his scanner. The confirmation had come through. He tapped accept, tore off the receipt, and set it on the corner of her desk. "Have a good morning," he said. He was back in the elevator before either of them had fully processed what had happened, but the words had already landed, and the room, though it looked exactly the same, wasn't. Michael didn't think about it on the drive back to the depot. He thought about Emma's school lunch. He'd packed the wrong crackers, the plain ones she merely tolerated, instead of the cheddar ones she loved. He thought about the tuition installment due Friday, and the way the numbers never quite lined up the way he arranged them in his head. He picked Emma up at 3. She ran to him the way she always did, backpack swinging, sneakers untied, with the unguarded speed of a kid who's never once doubted that someone would be waiting at the gate. She ducked under his arm and told him about the painting she'd made in art class, a woman in a chair with big wheels. The teacher had said people in chairs sometimes couldn't walk. Wheelchairs could do anything. And Emma had thought about that all afternoon and decided it was probably true, but also probably still hard, and that it mattered to know both things at once. Michael looked at the painting. The woman in the chair had orange hair and a yellow dress, and was smiling the tentative way kids draw smiles when they're trying to be kind. He didn't say anything. He folded it carefully and set it on the back seat. Sarah Mitchell hadn't said a word to anyone about what the delivery driver said. Not to Karen, not to her attorney, not to Richard Hayes when he called at noon to go over the board agenda. She'd simply carried on with the focused efficiency she'd spent 2 decades turning into something like armor. But efficiency takes full attention, and hers was no longer fully available. That evening, alone in her bathroom, she looked at her right foot for a long time. She hadn't looked at it that way, really studied it, in years. The doctors had always done the looking. She'd learned to be looked at rather than to look, somewhere in the years of appointments and assessments and careful explanations of things that couldn't be explained. She watched the foot. Nothing dramatic happened, but after 4 minutes of stillness, she thought, maybe imagined, a faint pull in the back of her calf. She told herself it was nothing. She called Karen at 9:15 that night. "The delivery driver from this morning, the one who brought the medical equipment. I need his full name and service ID." Karen was quiet for a moment. "I'll have it in the morning." "Tonight, please." By 10, a file sat open on Sarah's screen. Michael Aaron Turner, 32. Prior occupation, attending physician, neurology, Riverside General Hospital. Licensed through the current year, renewal pending. 6 years of research background in functional neurological disorder, psychogenic non-epileptic presentations, conversion spectrum conditions. Co-investigator on the Whitfield study, published and later contested in 2019. Current employment, regional delivery driver, Coastal Express Logistics, hired 14 months prior. Sarah read the file twice. Then she sat back and stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Why is he driving a truck?" she said to no one. She arranged a second delivery for Thursday morning, a shipment of office supplies fabricated in the order notes as an urgent replacement. Karen placed the order without comment. Before ending the call, she added one instruction. When he arrives, bring him directly and don't contact Richard first. Michael knew it wasn't a real delivery the moment the elevator doors opened. The corridor was the same, the cold air was the same, but Karen was waiting at the elevator instead of the office. Door wearing the carefully neutral expression of someone carrying out instructions she'd decided weren't hers to question. He set the box down inside the door. Sarah was waiting this time, not working. She'd turned the wheelchair toward the entrance, hands folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who'd rehearsed the posture. "You were a doctor," she said. He didn't confirm or deny it right away. He looked at her the way he had on Monday, not at her situation, not at the wheelchair, not at the carefully built professional surface. At her. "I was," he said. "You looked at me for 8 seconds and said something none of the 17 physicians in my file ever said. I'm not practicing anymore. I know. I read your file last night." She paused. "I'm not asking you to practice. I'm asking what you saw." Michael was quiet for a moment, not hesitation, but consideration, the kind a person takes when deciding whether the truth will cost more than it gives. "Functional neurological disorder," he said. "Your nervous system isn't broken, it's blocked. There's a difference. Structural paralysis from spinal damage or lesions doesn't produce the movement patterns you were showing Monday. Your right foot has involuntary microcontractions. Your protective reflexes are intact. The pathway's there. Your brain is suppressing the signal." Sarah said nothing. "FND doesn't come from physical damage," he went on. "It comes from a psychological event significant enough that the brain locks the motor system down. It's more common than Parkinson's. It's almost never diagnosed correctly because most physicians stop looking for physical causes and never think to look for any other kind." "And what caused mine?" It wasn't entirely a question. "I don't know, but you do." The silence that followed was different from the first one. This one had edges. "I'd like you to leave," she said. He picked up his scanner, left the receipt on the edge of her desk as before, and walked to the door. He paused there, without turning around. "The treatment doesn't require me," he said. "It requires you to say something out loud that you've never been allowed to say." Then he was gone. She didn't sleep that night either. She'd been 14 when it happened. A ski trip in Vermont the last week of February, 3 days before her mother's birthday. She'd been the one to suggest the off-trail run. She'd been the one who said it would be fine, that the slope wasn't too steep, that they were both good enough. Her best friend's name was Madison Carter, and Madison had followed her without hesitation because Madison always followed Sarah without hesitation. That was the nature of their friendship and the particular cruelty built into that kind of loyalty. Madison didn't come back up the mountain. Sarah hadn't said her name to anyone in years, not in the way that mattered, not in the private language of unfinished grief, not with the real weight attached. She'd said it in medical contexts, traumatic event at 14, witnessed fatality, close personal relationship. She'd said it as data. She'd never said it as love. She'd never said, "I'm sorry, Madison. I'm sorry I asked you to follow me somewhere. I shouldn't have led you." Richard Hayes had been a fixture in her professional life since she was 22, when she inherited the chairmanship of Halstead Capital after her father's death and found herself running a financial empire she hadn't yet learned to manage. He'd appeared at exactly the right moment, as certain people do, with competence, calm authority, and a kind of organized care that a grieving young woman in a wheelchair had found genuinely indispensable. He'd helped her build the Medical Advisory Council. He'd coordinated the specialist referrals. He'd been present at every consultation, every reassessment, every quiet disappointment when a new protocol produced no progress. For 20 years, Sarah had called this loyalty, until now she'd never considered a different word for it. The documentation she requested from Karen arrived in 4 separate folders: original medical records, intake notes, progress evaluations, treatment summaries. Sarah spent an evening going through them with the same focused precision she gave quarterly financial reviews. What she found arranged itself into a pattern, like patterns do once you know what shape you're looking for. 3 separate points in her treatment history where documented motor improvement had been followed within 2 weeks by a change of physician or a revised treatment protocol. Not dramatic changes, subtle redirections. 1 handwritten margin note, not Richard's and assistants, read, RCH requested file review before next session. The RCH was Richard Charles Hayes. She put the folders in her desk drawer and locked it. The call from the logistics company came on a Friday. Michael's supervisor used the word suspension in the same flat tone people use for bad news that isn't their own. There'd been a complaint. A client had reported inappropriate contact with a residential executive. Pending review. The wording was careful, legal, the kind of language built to do maximum damage with minimal traceable cause. Michael listened to the whole message standing in his kitchen while Emma ate cereal at the table behind him. He set the phone down. He stood at the counter a moment. Then he turned around, sat across from his daughter, and asked if she'd remembered her library book. She hadn't. This was a manageable problem. He was grateful for it. Karen told Sarah about the suspension on a Monday morning, in the same breath as the overnight legal summary and the board calendar revision. Sarah stopped her there. Karen repeated it. Sarah asked who'd filed the complaint. Karen said the name on the form was false, a shell entity tied to a private legal coordination firm Richard had retained as a consultant 3 years earlier. Sarah said nothing for a moment. Then, "Get me the original personnel file from Coastal Express and clear my 11 o'clock." Richard showed up at her office at 11:15, unscheduled, which was itself unusual. He wore his concern the way he wore his suits, tailored, composed, no visible seam. He sat across from her and spoke with quiet care about professional boundaries and the legal exposure of accepting informal medical contact from an unlicensed practitioner. He said the word protect 3 times. He said her name 4 times. He never once asked how she was feeling. Sarah looked at him, really looked, not with the practiced deference of 20 years of manufactured gratitude, but with the eyes of someone who's read the same document twice and understood it both times. "Thank you, Richard," she said. "I'll take it under advisement." He left satisfied. He shouldn't have been. It was a Tuesday when Emma showed up at the Halsted building by accident, which is to say, the accident was entirely predictable to anyone who knew her. Michael had brought her along to the lobby to sign off on a form for the personnel dispute, a standard clearance requiring in-person confirmation, and she'd waited about 4 minutes before deciding waiting wasn't something she was currently interested in. The lobby was large and pale and mostly empty at that hour, and Emma explored it with a systematic curiosity of a kid who treats every new space as a problem to be solved. She found the side corridor. She found an elevator propped open for facilities delivery. She found, when the doors opened on the 3rd floor, a woman in a black wheelchair waiting to board. They looked at each other. Emma didn't show the mix of pity and discomfort adults usually produced in that moment. She looked at Sarah with the open, direct attention of someone who hasn't yet learned to pretend she doesn't see what she sees. "Do you want to stand up?" Emma asked. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. "Everybody wants to," she said finally, quietly. Emma considered this. My dad wants to do lots of things he can't do yet, but he says you just have to start by remembering why you wanted to. She thought a moment longer. He says remembering is the hard part, the doing part comes after. Sarah went very still. Michael found Emma 40 seconds later, slightly out of breath, his hand truck abandoned in the lobby. He saw the two of them in the corridor, his daughter looking up at Sarah with her uncomplicated directness, and Sarah looking back with an expression he couldn't immediately name. Not the controlled professional surface he'd seen before. Something older. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching for Emma's hand. "She doesn't stay where you put her." "She told me something," Sarah said. Her voice was different, not softer exactly, but less armored. She said remembering is the hard part. Michael looked at his daughter. Emma wasn't paying attention to either of them anymore. She'd found a crack in the floor tile she found interesting. "I get that from me," he said, though she explains it better. Sarah looked at him for a moment. "I need you to not give up. I know what Richard did. I know why, and I'm not ready to stop." Michael was quiet. "I'm not practicing." "I know. Come back Wednesday, not here. Karen will send you an address. Bring nothing. Just come." Emma looked up from the floor tile. "Can I come too?" Sarah almost smiled. It was the first time in a long while that a smile arrived without being consciously built. The address was a fourth-floor apartment 2 blocks from the tower, Karen's personal residence, offered without an explanation and accepted without one. It had a good window and a clear stretch of floor between the couch and the wall, and that's all the space they needed. The first Wednesday, Michael talked about nothing medical. He asked about Madison. Sarah gave him single sentences at first, the abbreviated biography of grief a person produces after 20 years of compressing something too large to carry into the smallest possible form. Michael listened the way he used to listen to patients, without interrupting, without the forward lean of someone waiting for his turn. He simply received what was offered and let the next sentence arrive on its own. By the end of the hour, she'd said Madison's full name 4 times. The last time, she said it without any preceding clause, without context or explanation, just the name, plain and whole, the way a name sounds when you stop apologizing for needing to say it. "Was that the first time?" Michael asked. She didn't answer right away. "In the way that counts," she said finally, "yes." The second Wednesday, he taught her a breathing exercise, breath-movement coupling, a technique from FND protocol research designed to relink respiratory rhythm and voluntary motor output. The theory, the motor pathways in functional neurological disorder are suppressed, not absent, and certain rhythmic breathing patterns can open a temporary window for voluntary movement to travel through again. He guided her through it. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, and at the peak of each exhale, the smallest possible intentional movement of the left hand, not a command, an invitation. 12 minutes in, her left index finger moved, not a twitch, a deliberate extension and return, brief and quiet as a caught breath, but entirely under her own direction. Neither of them said anything. Michael kept his eyes on his hands, flat on the table in front of him. Sarah kept her eyes on the window. The room was very still. Her breathing changed, that was all, but it was enough. Richard Hayes arrived at the Halstead building at 7:30 that Thursday morning, 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and found the second level of the parking garage emptier than usual. He sat in his car for a moment, reviewing the report his investigator had sent overnight. It confirmed what he'd suspected. Michael Turner and Sarah Mitchell had been meeting at a private address for the past week. The address belonged to the executive assistant. The sessions weren't logged in the official medical schedule, weren't entered into the coordination calendar, weren't routed through any of the oversight channels Richard had spent years carefully maintaining. He understood what this meant, not immediately, but with the gradual, cold clarity of a man who's built a position on someone else's limitation and now watches the foundation start to shift. He hadn't done it out of malice in the beginning. That was the truth he returned to when he needed it. He'd done it out of the ordinary human instinct to be needed, and he'd learned over the years that the most efficient way to stay needed was to make sure nothing ever resolved. Small things. A phone call that redirected a promising specialist, a report that landed with the wrong committee, a treatment protocol modified just slightly, just enough. The money had come later, first as a consequence, then as a motivation, the two blurring together the way they do once a person stops examining his own reasons. He called his attorney. He used the phrase fiduciary incapacity. He used the phrase vulnerability assessment. He scheduled an emergency board session for the following Thursday. Karen saw the calendar notification at 11:15 that night and photographed it with her personal phone. She sent it to Sarah at 11:16. The third Wednesday began at 6 in the morning and ended at noon. By the end of it, Sarah could bear weight on both feet while gripping the edge of the windowsill. Not walking, not standing unassisted, but the transfer of weight, the physical fact of the floor pressing back against the soles of her feet, was real, and it was hers. She didn't celebrate. She sat back in the wheelchair, closed her eyes, and was quiet for a long time. Michael sat across the room and gave the quiet what it needed, nothing but space. "Tell me about your wife," she said. He was surprised by the question, though he probably shouldn't have been. He told her the important parts, the ones that fit in a few sentences. Rachel, 3 years ago. A surgical consent he'd signed because the attending had asked him to authorize it as a family decision, not as a physician. He'd known the risk profile. He'd accepted it. She hadn't made it through the surgery. He hadn't set foot in a medical context since. "You treated me," Sarah said, "but you haven't treated yourself." Michael looked at the window. "No," he agreed. "The license renewal, the envelope, you've been not opening it." He didn't ask how she knew. She'd simply read him the way he'd read her, with enough patience and enough care for what was actually visible rather than what was presented. "It requires a declaration of current practice intent," he said. "And you haven't decided yet." "Not until recently." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "Emma drew me a picture," she said, "the day you both came to the building. In it, I'm standing." "I know," she told me. "She said she also drew a star in the corner. She said it was for someone you missed, so they'd know they weren't forgotten." Michael was quiet a moment. "She told me she drew it for you," he said, "but I think she drew it for Rachel, too." "I think so, too." The board meeting convened at 9 that Thursday morning in the 38th floor conference room. 12 members. The table was long and pale, a surface built to project neutrality while enabling consequence. Richard sat at the far end with the settled confidence of a man who'd arranged the room in advance of arriving in it. He had the proposal in front of him, 6 pages, formally bound, requesting a temporary independent assessment of the CEO's decision-making capacity, following, as the language read, documented exposure to an unlicensed medical practitioner with potential undue influence concerns. He was midway through his opening remarks when the door opened. It wasn't the entrance that silenced the room. It was the absence of the wheelchair. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame, minimal support, not dependence. She wore charcoal and white. her posture steady, her expression the controlled, deliberate thing she'd spent a career constructing, but with something underneath it now for the first time that wasn't armor, it was ground. She walked to the head of the table slowly, not performing the slowness, simply moving at the pace her body offered. Each step was real. Each step was hers. She sat down. The wheelchair wasn't in the room. No one spoke for a long moment. She opened the leather folder she'd placed on the table before the meeting began. She'd arrived 40 minutes early. "I've been looking forward to this meeting because it's the last one Richard will attend in this building." Richard's composure held, though something shifted in his jaw. "Sarah, I understand this is an emotional. The original medical records," she slid a stack of documents to the center of the table, acquired directly from the managing archive, without routing through the advisory coordination office, which is to say, without Richard's office. She slid a second set alongside it. "Versions submitted to this board's Health Assessment Committee over the past 15 years. 3 material discrepancies. I've marked them." She placed a third document at the edge of the table. "The Whitfield paper, 2019, a peer-reviewed study demonstrating that functional neurological disorder, accurately diagnosed, has a recovery rate above 60% with appropriate intervention." Richard coordinated the filing of a contested review that delayed the paper's acceptance in 2 major journals for 11 months. During that time, none of the physicians in my care were shown the study. Richard stood. "You are not in a state to—" "I'm standing, Richard." Sarah said it, simply, without force, just the fact of it. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm standing. Would you like to explain to this board how that represents compromised judgment?" He didn't sit back down. He didn't speak again, either. The board chair, a quiet man named Harrington, who'd held his position for 9 years, mostly by being the last to speak in any room, cleared his throat and asked Richard to excuse himself, pending an independent review. He used the word pending the way people use it when they mean permanent. Richard left the room. He left the building an hour later. Michael was in the hallway when the board session ended. He hadn't panvited. He hadn't asked to be. He'd driven Emma to school at 7:45, watched her run through the gate with her backpack swinging, then driven across the city, ridden the elevator to the 38th floor, and sat down on a chair in the corridor because it was the only thing available to him, and it was enough. He was still wearing his jacket, not the delivery uniform, just a jacket, gray, worn at the left cuff, when the conference room door opened. Sarah crossed the corridor toward him without the chair. Her pace was still measured, but each step landed with something that hadn't been there before. Not performance, not proof, just the quiet, ordinary weight of a person moving through the world on her own terms. He stood up. She stopped a few feet away. Neither spoke for a moment. "I'm sorry about what Richard did with your suspension," she said. "That's been resolved." "I know. I resolved it." He almost smiled. "There's something I want to ask you. Why did you stop, really?" He'd answered a version of this question before, but not the real one, and they both knew it. He was quiet a moment, looking at the floor, then at her. "Because I could do everything the training required, and it still wasn't enough. And if it wasn't enough for Rachel, I wasn't sure I had the right to keep asking it of anyone else." Sarah was quiet. "Then you looked at me for 8 seconds and said the one thing no one else had said in 20 years. That's not someone who stopped knowing how to help. That's someone who stopped believing he had permission." He didn't respond right away. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you've seen each other at the bottom of something and survived it. "You healed me," she said, "but you haven't healed yourself. You said that before. I'll keep saying it until you open the envelope. Michael looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The rain had stopped sometime that morning. The city outside was damp and bright, the way cities are after a long rain, everything slightly more itself. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, Michael sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder. Inside was a completed license renewal declaration, signed, dated, intent declared. Active practice, neurological rehabilitation, FND specialty protocol. He'd filled it out slowly, over the course of a week, the way a person does something they've been afraid of for a long time, carefully, in installments, with patience for himself. He was looking at it when his phone buzzed. Sarah's name on the screen. 3 sentences. I walked to the park this morning. First time since I was 14. Thank you. He read it twice. Then he picked up a pen, signed the envelope flap, pressed it closed, and set it in the outgoing mail tray by the door.
Emma came into the kitchen in her pajamas, trailing her blanket, and looked at the envelope with the expression she used when deciding whether something was important. "Is that a good thing in that envelope, Daddy?" "Yes," he said, "a good thing." She climbed onto the chair across from him and accepted the glass of orange juice he slid over. She looked at him a moment with the uncomplicated directness that had always been her particular gift to him. "Is Miss Sarah coming for dinner this week?" Michael looked at the envelope, then at his daughter, then at the small, bright rectangle of window above the sink, where the morning was arriving without ceremony, ordinary and sufficient. "I'll ask her," he said. Emma nodded. This seemed to settle something for her. She drank her juice. He sat there another minute, in the kitchen of his small apartment, in the ordinary Tuesday morning light, and felt not happiness exactly, not yet, but the accurate precursor to it, the sense that the door was no longer locked and that whatever waited on the other side wasn't what he'd been afraid of. The envelope would be in the outgoing mail within an hour. 20 years wasn't a mystery. It was a story that needed the right person to listen long enough to hear it. Michael Turner had listened, not because he had the credentials, not because he had the protocol, but because he had the capacity to stay in a room with someone's truth without flinching. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, in the cases that matter most, that's the only instrument that works. He'd walked into her office with a hand truck and 2 boxes and 8 seconds of attention. She'd stood up and walked out of a room that had held her for 20 years. Neither of them had done it alone. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that would still be true tomorrow.